She was reading a paperback romance novel when the first hijacker stood up. By the time he noticed the small patch on her backpack, it was already too late. Flight 447 from Denver to Miami was about to become the shortest hijacking attempt in aviation history. But first, they had to make the mistake of underestimating the quiet blonde in seat 12A, who'd been sipping ginger ale and minding her own business for the past 2 hours. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Flight 447 was running 20 minutes late out of Denver International, which meant Rebecca Torres had extra time to finish chapter 16 of her trashy romance novel before the beverage service started. She'd chosen seat 12A, specifically middle of the plane. Aisle access, close enough to the emergency exits to matter, but far enough from the galley to avoid constant foot traffic. Old habits. The plane was a standard Boeing 737, about 60% full on this Tuesday afternoon in March. Business travelers heading to Miami, a few families with restless kids, the usual mix of people who had places to be and no patience for delays. Rebecca fit right in: jeans, plain white t-shirt, navy cardigan, blonde hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like every other 30-something woman traveling alone for work. That was the point. Her backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her. Black canvas with a few small patches sewn onto the back panel. Most people never noticed them. A Colorado flag, a small Grateful Dead dancing bear, and tucked in the corner where it barely caught the light, a small trident emblem in muted colors. Just another travel decoration to most eyes. She'd been reading for about an hour when the man in 8C started getting agitated. Rebecca noticed because she noticed everything. A habit that died hard after 8 years in the Navy. The guy was maybe 40, Middle Eastern features, sweating despite the cabin's cool temperature. He kept checking his watch and glancing toward the back of the plane. His carry-on bag sat in the overhead compartment directly above his seat, and he'd opened and closed the bin 3 times in the last 10 minutes. 2 rows behind him, another man was exhibiting similar behavior. Younger, maybe 25, clean-shaven, wearing a business casual shirt that was too tight across his shoulders. He was trying to look calm, but his knee bounced constantly and his eyes kept darting between his phone and the cockpit door. Rebecca marked him as the nervous type, the kind who'd panic first and think second. The third man was in the back, row 28. Rebecca had spotted him during boarding because he'd made eye contact with the other 2 as he walked down the aisle. A quick nod, nothing obvious, but enough to establish connection. He was older, maybe 50, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent time in the sun and wasn't afraid of hard work. He carried himself differently than the others, more confident, more controlled. The leader. Rebecca had been watching them for 30 minutes when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Folks, we're beginning our descent into Miami. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. The usual announcement that most passengers ignored. But the 3 men all tensed simultaneously. That's when Rebecca knew for certain what was coming. She closed her book slowly, marking her place with the boarding pass stub, and slipped it into the seat pocket in front of her. Then she did something that would have looked casual to anyone watching. She reached down and adjusted her backpack, rotating it slightly so the patches faced outward instead of against the seat. A small movement, barely noticeable. But it put the trident patch in clear view of anyone walking down the aisle. The man in 8C stood up first. He was trying to look casual, like he was just stretching his legs, but Rebecca could see the tension in his posture. His hand moved to his jacket pocket, not reaching inside, just checking that whatever was there hadn't moved. When he started walking toward the front of the plane, Rebecca knew the show was about to begin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man said, his voice carrying over the normal cabin noise. Not shouting, not panicked, just loud enough to get attention. "I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. The reaction was immediate but varied. Some passengers looked up from their phones and magazines with mild annoyance, assuming it was some kind of medical emergency or unruly passenger situation. Others, the ones who'd been through enough life to recognize real danger when it presented itself, went very still very quickly. The flight attendant in the front galley, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and 30 years of experience, took one look at the man's face and reached for the phone to the cockpit. That's when he pulled the knife. It wasn't a big knife. Airline security had improved too much for anything dramatic. Just a utility blade, maybe 3 inches long, the kind you could buy at any hardware store and possibly slip past TSA in a carefully packed carry-on. But in the confined space of an aircraft cabin, it might as well have been a sword. "Phone down," he said to the flight attendant. Now, the cabin erupted in the predictable chaos of people who suddenly realized they were in serious trouble. A woman in the front row started crying. Someone's child began asking loud questions that no parent knew how to answer. A businessman in first class was already on his phone trying to call 911, apparently forgetting that cell service at 30,000 feet was spotty at best. The second man, the nervous one from row 10, had moved to the middle of the cabin and was now standing in the aisle, looking like he might throw up. His job was apparently crowd control, keeping people from rushing the hijacker with the knife. He pulled out his own blade, smaller than his partner's, but sharp enough to make people think twice about being heroic. "Everyone just stay calm," the nervous one said, his voice cracking slightly. "Nobody needs to get hurt. We just need to talk to the pilot." The third man, the leader, was still in his seat, but Rebecca could see him preparing to move. He was the one with the real weapon, she was certain of it. The other two were muscle and distraction. This guy was the professional. Rebecca remained perfectly still in her seat, hands folded in her lap, looking for all the world like a frightened passenger hoping not to draw attention. But her mind was working fast, cataloging exits, counting potential hostiles, assessing the tactical situation. The plane was still in descent, maybe 15 minutes from landing. The cockpit door was locked and reinforced, standard post 9/11 security. These guys would need leverage to get the pilots to cooperate. That's when the man with the knife made his first mistake. He started walking down the aisle, looking for someone who seemed important enough to serve as a hostage. His eyes swept over the crying woman, dismissed the businessman still fumbling with his phone, passed over an elderly couple clutching each other's hands, and then he saw Rebecca, young enough to be valuable, old enough to follow instructions. Traveling alone, which meant no complicated family dynamics to manage. Sitting in the middle of the plane where everyone could see her, which would make her useful as an example. She was perfect. "You," he said, pointing the knife in her direction. "Blonde girl. Stand up." Rebecca looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "Me? Yeah, you." "Get up." Slowly. She stood up carefully, hands visible, playing the role of terrified civilian perfectly. The knife was now about 3 feet from her throat, close enough that she could smell the man's nervous sweat and see the slight tremor in his hands. He was scared too, which made him dangerous in a different way. "What's your name?" he asked. "Rebecca," she said, her voice small and shaky. "Please, I just want to go home." The man smiled, apparently pleased with her compliance. "Rebecca's going to help us talk to the pilot," he announced to the cabin. "As long as everyone stays calm and follows instructions, Rebecca's going to be just fine." He gestured for her to move toward the front of the plane, keeping the knife close to her back. As they walked, Rebecca caught sight of her reflection in one of the small cabin windows. There she was, the quiet girl, the frightened passenger, the perfect victim. What the hijacker couldn't see was the small patch on her backpack, now clearly visible to anyone behind her in the aisle. The trident insignia that marked her as something very different from what she appeared to be. What he definitely couldn't see was the way her hands had stopped, shaking the moment he'd chosen her as his hostage. or the way her breathing had shifted from panic to controlled, or the slight smile that played at the corner of her mouth as she calculated distances, angles, and the precise amount of force it would take to disarm a man holding a knife in the cramped confines of an aircraft aisle. Rebecca Torres had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years before she transitioned to private security work. She'd completed 3 combat deployments, survived SEER training, and earned commendations for operations that would never appear in any public record. But to the man with the knife, she was just the quiet girl in 12, who'd picked the wrong flight to read her romance novel. He had no idea that choosing her as his hostage was the last mistake he was ever going to make. As a free man, the cockpit door was reinforced steel, designed to withstand everything from terrorist attacks to decompression events. The hijacker with the knife, who had introduced himself to the cabin as Omar, seemed to think he could intimidate his way through it by pressing the blade against Rebecca's throat and shouting demands. "Open the door or the girl dies," Omar yelled, his voice echoing off the narrow galley walls. Behind him, his nervous partner was struggling to keep 47 passengers under control with nothing but a small utility knife and increasingly shaky bravado. Rebecca could have told Omar that modern cockpit protocols meant the pilots wouldn't open that door, even if he had a gun to her head. Post 9/11. Aviation security was designed around one simple principle: the cockpit stays sealed no matter what happens in the cabin. The pilots had already triggered the hijack alert code, and every air traffic control center between Denver and Miami knew Flight 447 was in trouble, but Omar didn't know that. His entire plan seemed based on movies from the 1980s where hijackers could simply demand access to the controls and expect cooperation. Instead, Captain Williams and First Officer Chun were following protocol: maintain control of the aircraft, communicate with ground control, and under no circumstances open the reinforced door that separated them from the chaos behind. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third hijacker, the leader, finally stood up from row 28. He was bigger than Rebecca had initially assessed, maybe 6'2", solid build, moving with the kind of confidence that suggested military training. Unlike his 2 partners, he wasn't panicking or shouting. He walked calmly toward the front of the plane, and passengers instinctively pressed themselves back into their seats as he passed. "Omar," he said quietly, "step back." His voice carried authority that made Omar immediately comply, though he kept the knife pointed at Rebecca. The leader studied the cockpit door for a moment, then looked directly at Rebecca for the first time. "What's your full name?" he asked. "Rebecca Torres," she replied, maintaining the frightened civilian act while internally cataloging everything about him. Faded tan line around his wrist where a watch had been, removed before the flight to avoid metal detectors. Small scar on his left hand between thumb and forefinger, knife training accident, probably military. The way he stood balanced on the balls of his feet despite the aircraft's movement. Someone comfortable in unstable environments. "What do you do for work, Rebecca?" "I'm in IT consulting," she lied smoothly. It was close enough to her current job in cybersecurity to be believable under stress. He nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he did something that surprised everyone in the cabin. He pulled out a small device that looked like a modified smartphone and held it against the cockpit door. "Thermal imaging," he explained to no one in particular. 2 people in there, both seated. Pilot and co-pilot, probably already squawking 7,500 to air traffic control. Omar looked confused. "Squawking what?" The leader sighed. "Hijack code, Omar. They've already told ground control we're up here. Which means we have maybe 20 minutes before F-16s start flying escort patterns around U.S. Rebecca revised her assessment immediately. This wasn't some amateur operation thrown together by desperate men with box cutters. The leader knew aviation protocol, understood air traffic control procedures, and had come prepared with specialized equipment. The thermal device wasn't something you picked up at Radio Shack. "So what's the plan, Malik?" Omar asked, and Rebecca filed away the name. Malik walked to the aircraft's phone system and picked up the handset that connected to ground operations. His fingers moved quickly over the keypad, and within 30 seconds he had a connection. "Miami Air Traffic Control. This is the passenger representative aboard United Flight 447, he said, his voice completely calm and professional. "We need to establish communication with your crisis management team." Rebecca could hear the response crackling through the phone speaker. Confusion, requests for identification, demands to speak to the flight crew. Malik waited patiently for the initial chaos to subside before speaking again. "We have 47 passengers and 3 crew members. Everyone is currently safe. We're requesting a direct radio frequency for negotiation purposes and a contact number for FBI crisis negotiation. We'll maintain the current flight path until communication is established." The sophistication of his approach sent chills through Rebecca that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This was military-level operational planning. Malik wasn't just some terrorist with a grudge. He was a professional. While Malik handled communications, his 2 subordinates were revealing just how unprofessional they were by comparison. Omar had moved away from Rebecca, but was now pacing back and forth in the narrow galley, knife in hand, working himself into an increasingly agitated state. Every few minutes he'd shout something at the cockpit door or wave his weapon at passengers who looked at him wrong. The nervous hijacker in the middle cabin, who Rebecca had heard Malik call Yusuf, was having an even worse time of it. A businessman in seat 14B had tried to argue with him about using the bathroom, and Yusuf's response had been to threaten the man's wife sitting beside him. Now he was dealing with a cabin full of passengers who were more angry than scared, and his authority was crumbling by the minute. "I said nobody moves," Yusuf shouted when an elderly woman tried to reach for her purse. "Everyone stay in your seats." "She's diabetic," her husband said calmly. "She needs her medication." Yusuf looked desperately toward Malik, who was still on the phone with ground control. Getting no immediate guidance, he made the mistake of trying to handle the situation himself. "What medication?" he demanded. "Insulin," the woman said. "It's in my purse in the overhead compartment." Yusuf stared at her, clearly having no idea whether diabetic medication was something that could be weaponized or used to signal for help. His knowledge of hijacking apparently came from the same 1980s movie playbook that Omar was following. "You can't have it," he decided. The woman's husband, a man in his 70s with the bearing of someone who had probably served in Vietnam, stood up slowly. "Son, my wife has been diabetic for 30 years. She takes insulin shots on a schedule. It's not negotiable. Sit down." Yusuf waved his knife, but his hand was shaking now. "I'll sit down after you let my wife get her medication." That's when Rebecca realized just how quickly this situation could deteriorate. Yusuf was panicking. Omar was getting more agitated by the minute, and they had a cabin full of passengers who were starting to understand that their captors weren't the hardened terrorists they were pretending to be. The only real professional was Malik, and he was busy trying to negotiate with federal agents who were trained never to negotiate with hijackers. Rebecca shifted slightly in her seat, a movement so small it was barely perceptible. But it put her in position to reach Yusuf in 3 quick steps if he decided to hurt the elderly couple. Her years of SEAL training had taught her to read tactical situations, and this one was heading toward violence fast. The woman was indeed diabetic. Rebecca could see the slight tremor in her hands, and the way her husband was monitoring her breathing. If she went into diabetic shock at 30,000 feet, it wouldn't matter how the hijacking ended. And Yusuf, in his ignorance and panic, was about to create a medical emergency that could kill someone. "Please," the woman said quietly. "I just need my insulin pen." "It's not dangerous to anyone." Yusuf looked around wildly, seeking guidance that wasn't coming. Omar was still shouting at the cockpit door. Malik was deep in conversation with someone on the ground who was probably FBI or Homeland Security. No one was managing the cabin, and the situation was spiraling out of control. That's when Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She stood up slowly, hands visible, and spoke in the same frightened voice she'd been using since the hijacking began. "Excuse me, but maybe I could help?" Yusuf spun toward her, knife extended. "Sit down." "I'm sorry, I just ... Rebecca let her voice trail off, playing the nervous civilian perfectly. "I'm a nurse. Well, I used to be. Before IT, I know about diabetes." It was another lie, but delivered with the kind of hesitant sincerity that people under stress tend to believe. And it gave her a reason to be standing, a reason to be moving, and most importantly, a reason to be closer to the situation when it inevitably went bad. "A nurse?" Yusuf repeated. "Yes, and she really does need that insulin. If she goes into shock up here ... Rebecca gestured vaguely at the aircraft around them. "There's nowhere to land for emergency medical care." The logical part of Yusuf's brain was apparently still functioning, because he recognized the truth in what she was saying. If his hostages started dying from medical emergencies, his already thin bargaining position would disappear entirely. "You know about this stuff?" he asked. "Basic medical training, yes." Rebecca took a small step closer, just positioning herself better. "I could check on her, make sure she's stable." "If you want." Yusuf looked toward Malik again, but the leader was still absorbed in his phone conversation with ground control, making a decision he probably wasn't qualified to make. Yusuf nodded. "Okay, but no funny business." Rebecca moved carefully toward the elderly couple, and as she did, she caught the eye of the husband. What she saw there surprised her. Not fear, but recognition. This man had been in situations before. He'd seen people under stress, understood tactical dynamics, and was reading the same signs she was. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw him give the slightest nod. He understood that she was more than she appeared to be. The question was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to do something about it before one of the hijackers' incompetents got someone killed, because whatever plan Malik had in mind, his two subordinates were clearly not up to executing it. And in Rebecca's experience, that's usually when professionals stepped in to take control of the situation, even if they had to do it from the inside. Rebecca knelt beside the elderly woman, whose name was Dorothy, and gently took her wrist to check her pulse. It was elevated but steady, consistent with stress rather than diabetic emergency. Her husband, who had introduced himself as Frank, watched Rebecca's movements with the sharp attention of someone who understood medical procedures. "When did you last take your insulin, Mrs. Patterson?" Rebecca asked, using her softest, most professional voice. "About 2 hours before the flight," Dorothy replied. "I'm supposed to take my next dose with lunch. But ... She gestured helplessly at the chaos surrounding them. Rebecca nodded and looked up at Yusuf, who was hovering nearby with his knife, trying to appear in control while clearly having no idea what he was doing. "She's stable for now, but she need her insulin pen within the next hour. It's just a small device, looks like a thick marker. Not dangerous to anyone." Yusuf glanced toward the front of the cabin where Malik was, still deep in conversation with federal negotiators. The leader had established a remarkably professional dialogue with whoever was handling the crisis on the ground. His voice remained calm, his demands specific and reasonable: fuel, flight path changes, communication protocols. He sounded more like an air traffic controller than a terrorist. "I don't know," Yusuf said, his voice cracking slightly. "Malik didn't say anything about medical stuff." Rebecca stood up slowly, making sure to keep her hands visible, and her posture non-threatening. But as she rose, she used the movement to scan the entire cabin, cataloging information that would be crucial if this situation continued to deteriorate. 40-7 passengers, as Malik had told ground control. Mostly adults, but 3 children, 2 teenagers and 1 boy who looked about 8 years old. The flight attendant crew consisted of 2 women and 1 man, all of whom were following proper protocol by staying visible and available but not interfering with the hijackers' operations. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 737-800, which Rebecca knew well from her military transport experience. 2 emergency exits over the wings, 1 at the front, 1 at the rear. The cabin pressure was stable, meaning they were still at cruising altitude, probably around 35,000 feet based on the engine, sound and her inner ear pressure. Most importantly, she could see that several passengers were starting to organize themselves mentally. The businessman in 14B, who had initially argued with Yusuf, was now making subtle eye contact with other male passengers. A woman in her 40s, sitting alone in 18C, had quietly moved her purse to the aisle side of her seat where she could reach it quickly. These people were preparing for the possibility that they might need to act. "Ma'am," Frank said quietly, drawing Rebecca's attention back to the immediate situation. "My wife really does need that medication soon." There was something in the way he said it that made Rebecca look at him more carefully. Frank Patterson was probably 75 years old, with the kind of weathered hands that spoke of decades of physical work. But his posture was military straight, despite his age, and when he'd stood up to Yusuf earlier, he'd moved with the controlled precision of someone who'd been trained in close-quarters combat. "Were you in the service, Mr. Patterson?" Rebecca asked quietly. Frank's eyes met hers, and she saw confirmation there. "Army, a long time ago. Where did you serve?" "Various places, you?" It was a careful question, phrased in a way that acknowledged he suspected her background, without making any direct accusations that could be overheard. Rebecca made a quick decision. "Navy," she said quietly. "Also various places." Frank nodded once, a slight smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Thought so. You move like my old unit commander." It was the kind of recognition that happened between veterans, an understanding that transcended age, branch of service, or circumstances. Frank had identified her as military, and she'd confirmed it. Now they had the foundation for coordination if the situation required it. "Dorothy," Frank said to his wife, "why don't you try to rest? The nice nurse here says you're doing fine for now." Dorothy Patterson was clearly a sharp woman who had been married to a military man long enough to understand subtext. She leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, but Rebecca could see the slight tension in her shoulders that indicated she was listening to everything happening around her. Yusuf, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly agitated as his authority continued to erode. 2 more passengers had requested bathroom breaks. A child was crying despite his mother's attempts to quiet him, and the man in the business suit was now openly ignoring Yusuf's orders to stay seated while he comforted his obviously frightened wife. "Everyone needs to stop talking," Yusuf shouted, waving his knife in a way that was more likely to hurt himself than anyone else. "Just sit down and be quiet." But airplane cabins aren't designed for silence. There's always the constant hum of engines, the whisper of air circulation, the subtle creaks and shifts of an aircraft in flight. And when people are afraid, they tend to whisper, shuffle, and move in ways that create even more ambient noise. Rebecca used the cover of this natural sound to begin what she thought of as intelligence gathering. Moving slowly and naturally, she made her way back toward her original seat, stopping to check on other passengers along the way. To anyone watching, she looked like a concerned healthcare worker making sure everyone was okay. In reality, she was conducting reconnaissance. The woman in 18C was Dr. Sarah Kim, a cardiac surgeon from Denver heading to a medical conference in Miami. She was calm, alert, and when Rebecca asked if she was okay, Dr. Kim responded with the kind of steady competence that Rebecca associated with people who worked well under pressure. Businessman in 14B was Robert Chun, a financial consultant traveling with his wife Linda. He was angry rather than frightened, which made him potentially useful, but also potentially dangerous if he decided to act without coordination. The teenagers were Emma and Jake Morrison, traveling with their mother to visit grandparents in Florida. Emma was 16, old enough to understand the seriousness of the situation. Jake was 14 and trying very hard to be brave for his mother's sake. The 8-year-old boy was traveling alone as an unaccompanied minor. His name was Tyler, and he was being remarkably calm considering the circumstances. Rebecca suspected someone had explained to him that the best thing he could do was stay quiet and listen to the groan dash-ups. As she moved through the cabin, Rebecca also paid careful attention to the hijackers themselves. Omar was still at the front, alternating between shouting at the cockpit door and pacing in the narrow galley. His agitation was increasing, and she could see sweat stains spreading under his arms, despite the cool cabin temperature. Malik remained focused on his phone conversation, but Rebecca could see him monitoring the cabin situation through peripheral vision. He was clearly aware that his subordinates were struggling to maintain control, but seemed confident that his negotiations with ground authorities would resolve the situation before things got out of hand. Problem was that Rebecca's military experience had taught her that situations like this rarely went according to anyone's plan, especially when part of the team was composed of amateurs who were operating on adrenaline and bad movies. She was making her way back toward her seat when she heard Malik's voice change tone on the phone. Not louder but sharper. More focused. "That's not acceptable," he was saying. "We discussed fuel and flight path modifications. I'm not interested in landing at your choice of airports." Rebecca couldn't hear the response, but she could see Malik's jaw tighten. Whatever the federal negotiators were proposing, it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Listen to me very carefully," Malik continued, his voice dropping to a level that somehow carried more menace than any amount of shouting. "I have 47 passengers and I have a very specific timeline. You can work with me, or you can explain to their families why you chose not to cooperate." The shift in his tone sent a chill through the cabin. This wasn't the voice of someone making empty threats. This was the voice of a professional who had contingency plans and was prepared to use them. Rebecca settled back into her seat and picked up her romance novel, but instead of reading, she used it as cover while she processed everything she'd learned in the past 30 minutes. Malik was definitely military trained and had access to sophisticated equipment. His operation was planned and funded, not some desperate improvisation. But his timeline was inflexible, which suggested external constraints, probably involving ground coordination, that couldn't be delayed. Omar and Youssef were liabilities who were already creating problems that could escalate into violence. They were scared, unprofessional, and armed with knives in an environment where panic could turn deadly very quickly. Passengers included at least 2 military veterans, a trauma surgeon, and several people who were preparing mentally to resist if necessary. But they were also families with children, elderly travelers, and people who would be more hindrance than help in a crisis situation. Most critically, Rebecca was now positioned as a trusted neutral party who could move around the cabin without attracting suspicion. Frank Patterson had identified her as military. Dr. Kim had accepted her as medical personnel, and even Youssef saw her as a helpful nurse who could manage passenger problems. She was exactly where she needed to be to gather intelligence and coordinate response. The question was whether she would have time to use that position before one of the hijackers' mistakes got someone killed, because as she listened to Malik's increasingly tense conversation with federal negotiators, Rebecca was beginning to understand that this hijacking wasn't about money, politics, or even terrorism in the traditional sense. This was about something much more specific and much more dangerous. And she was running out of time to figure out what it was before the situation exploded into violence that none of them might survive. The first sign that Malik's plan was unraveling came when the aircraft began a subtle banking turn to the left. It was barely perceptible to most passengers, but Rebecca felt it immediately. The slight shift in gravitational force, the change in engine pitch, the way her inner ear registered the deviation from straight and level flight. They were no longer flying toward Miami. Malik felt it too. He looked up from his phone conversation with sharp attention, his eyes moving toward the windows where the afternoon sun had shifted position. Without ending his call, he walked quickly toward the cockpit door and pressed his thermal imaging device against the reinforced barrier. "They're changing course," he said into the phone, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That wasn't part of our agreement." Rebecca couldn't hear the response, but she could see Malik's jaw muscles working as he listened. Whatever the federal negotiators were telling him, it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "No," Malik said finally. "Absolutely not. We stick to the original flight plan or this conversation ends." He terminated the call and immediately began dialing a different number. Not the ground control frequency this time, something else. Rebecca watched him carefully, noting the way his fingers moved over the keypad. It was muscle memory, a number he'd dialed many times before. "Phase 2, Malik said when the call connected. "They're trying to divert us to Atlanta." Phase 2. That confirmed what Rebecca had suspected. This wasn't a standalone operation. There were people on the ground coordinating with Malik, and they had contingency plans for different scenarios. The question was what Phase 2 involved and whether it would make the situation more or less dangerous for the passengers. While Malik handled his coordination call, Omar was becoming increasingly unhinged at the front of the cabin. The banking turn had made him paranoid about the pilot's intentions, and he was now pounding on the cockpit door with his fist while brandishing his knife. "Open this door," Omar shouted. "I know you can hear me in there." Of course they could hear him. The entire cabin could hear him. But Captain Williams and First Officer Chun were following protocol, and that protocol didn't include negotiations with terrorists, regardless of how loudly they yelled. Rebecca used Omar's distraction to catch Frank Patterson's eye. The elderly veteran was watching the situation with the calm assessment of someone who had been in combat before. When their eyes met, Rebecca made a subtle gesture, a slight tilt of her head toward the emergency exits over the wings. Frank understood immediately. He gave an almost imperceptible nod and began to shift his position slightly, ostensibly to comfort his wife, but actually to get a better angle on the wing exits. The problem was that even if they could coordinate passenger resistance, they were still at 35,000 feet in a pressurized aircraft, traveling at 500 miles per hour. Taking control of the cabin wouldn't matter if they couldn't regain control of the cockpit, and the reinforced door made that virtually impossible. Unless someone had access to the aircraft's emergency systems, Rebecca's military experience had included extensive training on various aircraft types, including civilian airliners. She knew that Boeing 737s had manual overrides for critical systems, including cabin pressure and oxygen supply. Most importantly, they had emergency protocols that could force cockpit communication in life-threatening situations. The trick was creating a situation that would justify using those protocols without actually endangering the passengers that she was considering her options when Youssef made a critical mistake. The 8-year-old boy, Tyler, had been remarkably well behaved throughout the hijacking. But he was still a child, and children have biological needs that don't pause for terrorist operations. He raised his small hand tentatively and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the cabin tension. "Excuse me, sir. I really need to use the bathroom." Youssef spun toward him, knife extended, clearly at the end of his patience with passenger requests. "No, nobody moves." "But I really have to go," Tyler said. his voice starting to shake with the kind of desperation that every parent recognizes. The child's mother. Rebecca realized he wasn't traveling alone after all. Just separated from his family by seat assignments. Started to stand up from 3 rows back. Please, he's just 8 years old. He can't. Sit down. Yusuf screamed, now waving his knife at both the child and his mother. That's when Dr. Sarah Kim made her move. Cardiac surgeon had been watching the situation with the same professional calm she probably brought to her operating room. When Yusuf threatened a child, her medical instincts overrode any concerns about personal safety. "Young man," Dr. Kim said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen regardless of the circumstances. "That child has a medical need. Denying bathroom access to children can cause serious health complications." Yusuf turned his attention to her, and Rebecca could see him struggling with competing priorities. He wanted to maintain control, but he was also clearly out of his depth dealing with complex passenger management. "What kind of health complications?" he asked, apparently unable to resist engaging with someone who sounded like they knew what they were talking about. "Urinary tract infections, kidney problems, bladder damage," Dr. Kim replied matter-of-factly. "Children's systems are different from adults. They can't just hold it for extended periods without medical consequences." Rebecca watched this exchange with growing appreciation for Dr. Kim's tactical thinking. The surgeon was systematically undermining Yusuf's authority by positioning herself as the expert on passenger welfare. More importantly, she was creating doubt in his mind about whether he could simply ignore passenger needs without creating bigger problems. "I don't know," Yusuf said, glancing toward Malik for guidance. But Malik was still absorbed in his phone conversation, and Omar was still pounding uselessly on the cockpit door. Yusuf was on his own, and he clearly wasn't equipped to handle command decisions. "Look," Dr. Kim continued, "the bathroom is right there. The child can go. Come straight back to his seat, and you can watch him the entire time. There's no risk to your operation." Tyler nodded eagerly, his need clearly becoming urgent. Rebecca saw an opportunity and took it. "I could escort him," she offered in her helpful nurse voice. "Make sure he stays safe and comes right back." It was a calculated risk. Rebecca wanted to get closer to the aircraft's rear section where some of the emergency systems were located. The bathrooms were near the tail of the aircraft, close to the rear exit and the manual controls for several critical systems. Yusuf looked desperately between Tyler, Dr. Kim, Rebecca, and his 2 partners who were providing no guidance. Finally, his basic human decency won out over his terrorist instructions. "Fine," he said, "but make it quick. And no talking." Rebecca stood up carefully and extended her hand to Tyler, who scrambled out of his seat with obvious relief. As they walked toward the rear of the aircraft, Rebecca used the opportunity to assess the tail section more carefully. The rear emergency exit was directly over the wing root, where the aircraft's center of gravity was located. More importantly, it was near the manual release for the cabin pressure system, a feature designed to allow flight crews to equalize pressure in emergency situations. "Thank you for helping me," Tyler whispered as they reached the bathroom door. "You're being very brave," Rebecca whispered back. "Just do what you need to do, and we'll go right back to your seat." While Tyler used the facilities, Rebecca quickly examined the area around the rear galley. As she'd hoped, the manual controls for several emergency systems were accessible from this location, including the emergency oxygen deployment system that would force immediate communication between the cabin and cockpit. Plan that was forming in Rebecca's mind was dangerous and would require precise timing. But it was also their best chance of regaining control of the situation before Malik's mysterious timeline reached whatever deadline was. Driving his operation. When Tyler emerged from the bathroom, Rebecca walked him back to his seat, noting that several passengers watched their return with interest. Word was spreading quietly through the cabin that the hijackers could be reasoned with, that passenger needs were being accommodated. More importantly, Rebecca had established herself as someone who could move around the aircraft without triggering immediate suspicion. As she settled back into her own seat, Rebecca caught sight of her reflection in the small window beside her. She looked like exactly what she'd been pretending to be, a helpful civilian trying to make the best of a terrible situation. But reflected in the same window, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was the small trident patch on her backpack. The insignia that marked her as something very different from what she appeared to be. Malik finished his phone call and walked back into the main cabin, his expression grim. Whatever Phase 2 involved, Rebecca suspected they were about to find out. "Ladies and gentlemen," Malik announced, his voice carrying the same professional calm he'd maintained throughout the hijacking. "We're going to be making a slight change to our flight plan." He paused, studying the faces of the passengers, his eyes lingering on Rebecca for just a moment longer than the others. "I want everyone to understand that your cooperation has been exemplary so far. Let's keep it that way." There was something in his tone that suggested the easy part of this hijacking was over. Whatever came next was going to test everyone's limits, hijackers and passengers alike. Rebecca settled back in her seat and prepared for Phase 2, whatever that might involve. But now she had all eyes positioned throughout the cabin, knowledge of the aircraft's emergency systems, and most importantly, she had established herself as someone the hijackers trusted. She was exactly where she needed to be when the situation inevitably spiraled beyond anyone's control. Malik's announcement about the flight plan change was interrupted by a sound that made everyone in the cabin freeze, the distant but unmistakable roar of jet engines that weren't there. Through the small windows, Rebecca caught a glimpse of gray metal sliding into formation about a quarter-mile off their starboard wing. F-16 Fighting Falcon, probably out of Homestead Air Reserve Base in Florida. As she watched, a second fighter appeared on the port side, matching their speed and altitude with military precision. The message was clear. Flight 447 was now under military escort, and any attempt to deviate from approved flight paths would be met with overwhelming force. Malik saw the fighters too. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady when he continued his announcement. "As I was saying, we'll be adjusting our destination. Instead of Miami, we'll be landing at a facility better equipped to handle our ... specific requirements." Omar had stopped pounding on the cockpit door and was now staring out the windows at the fighter jets with obvious terror. "Malik, they're going to shoot us down," he whispered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "No, they're not," Malik replied calmly. "Fighter escort is standard protocol. They're there to ensure we don't encounter any ... complications ... From other aircraft." Rebecca understood what he meant. The F-16s weren't there to shoot them down. They were there to clear airspace and maintain separation from commercial traffic. More importantly, they were there to ensure that Flight 447 went exactly where the federal authorities wanted it to go, regardless of what Malik had planned. But Malik didn't seem particularly concerned about the fighter escort. If anything, he appeared to be expecting it, which suggested that his ground team had anticipated this level of federal response and had planned accordingly. That's when Rebecca noticed something that made her blood run cold. Malik had pulled out what looked like a modified tablet computer and was running some kind of diagnostic program. The screen showed what appeared to be aircraft systems data, altitude, airspeed, fuel consumption, and other flight parameters that shouldn't have been accessible to passengers. He wasn't just monitoring their aircraft's performance. He was somehow tapped into the flight management system. Rebecca's military training included extensive briefings on aircraft vulnerabilities, and she knew that modern airliners were essentially flying computers. Every system, from navigation to engine management to cabin pressure, was controlled by interconnected digital networks. If someone had the right equipment and expertise, those networks could potentially be compromised. The thermal imaging device, Malik had used earlier wasn't just for checking on the pilots. It was part of a sophisticated electronic warfare package that had given him access to the aircraft's internal systems, which meant this wasn't just a hijacking. It was a cyber attic with hostages. "Dr. Kim," Rebecca said quietly, leaning across the aisle to the cardiac surgeon. "Do you have any experience with aviation medicine?" Dr. Kim looked puzzled by the question. "Some. Basic flight physiology, decompression injuries, that sort of thing." "Why?" "I'm concerned about the altitude," Rebecca lied smoothly. "Some of the passengers are showing signs of hypoxia, confusion, agitation, poor judgment. It was a calculated risk." Rebecca was betting that Dr. Kim would understand the medical terminology but wouldn't immediately realize that hypoxia symptoms at normal cabin pressure altitude were virtually impossible. Dr. Kim's eyes sharpened as she processed what Rebecca was really saying. The surgeon was smart enough to understand that the medical concern was actually coded communication about something else entirely. "What would you recommend?" Dr. Kim asked carefully. "Emergency oxygen might help stabilize everyone," Rebecca replied. "There are manual deployment controls in the rear galley." Dr. Kim nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand that Rebecca knew more about aircraft systems than a typical IT consultant should know. Meanwhile, Frank Patterson had been quietly working on his own preparations. Rebecca noticed that he'd managed to position himself and Dorothy near the emergency exit row, ostensibly so Dorothy could stretch her legs, but actually to give them quick access to the wing exit if needed. More importantly, Frank had been having whispered conversations with Robert Chun, the angry businessman, and his wife Linda. Rebecca couldn't hear what they were discussing, but she could see Robert's body language, shifting from frustrated passenger to someone preparing for coordinated action. The cabin was dividing into two groups: those who were resigned to being passive victims, and those who were quietly preparing for the possibility of resistance. Rebecca was pleased to see that the second group was larger than she'd initially expected, but any plans for passenger resistance became complicated when Malik made his next announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to understand something important," he said, his voice carrying easily over the engine noise. "This aircraft is now under my complete control. Not just the cabin, the entire aircraft." To demonstrate his point, Malik pressed something on his tablet. The cabin lights dimmed momentarily, then returned to normal. It was a subtle demonstration, but the message was unmistakable. He could control electrical systems throughout the plane. "The pilots are still flying," Malik continued, "but only because I'm allowing them to. If anyone attempts to interfere with my operation, I can make flying this aircraft much more challenging." For them, Rebecca felt her heart rate increase. If Malik truly had access to critical flight systems, then passenger resistance wasn't just dangerous, it could be suicidal. At 35,000 feet, any interference with flight controls, navigation, or life support systems could kill everyone on board. But Rebecca also knew something that Malik probably didn't expect anyone to know. Aircraft emergency systems were designed with manual overrides specifically to prevent the kind of electronic compromise he was demonstrating. The engineers who built these planes had anticipated that digital systems might fail or be corrupted, and they'd built in analog backups. The trick was getting to those manual overrides without triggering whatever electronic countermeasures Malik had in place. "Sir?" Tyler's mother, Jessica Morrison, raised her hand tentatively. "My son is a diabetic too, like the elderly lady. He's going to need his medication soon." Rebecca's attention snapped to the woman. Tyler wasn't diabetic. She'd escorted him to the bathroom less than an hour ago, and there had been no mention of medical conditions. Jessica Morrison was lying, and she was doing it for a reason. "Where is his medication?" Malik asked, apparently taking the claim at face value. "In my carry-on bag. Overhead compartment above row 16. Malik considered this for a moment, then nodded to Youssef. "Get the bag." Check it carefully. As Yusef moved toward row 16, Rebecca realized what Jessica Morrison was actually doing. She was creating a reason for the overhead compartments to be opened and searched. But why? The answer came when Yusef opened the overhead bin and started going through Jessica's carry-on bag. Along with the usual travel items, he found a small electronic device that looked like a medical monitor, but was actually something else entirely. "What is this?" Yusef asked, holding up the device. Jessica's face went pale. It monitors his blood sugar levels. Connects to his insulin pump. Rebecca recognized the device immediately. It wasn't a medical monitor, it was a satellite communication unit. The kind used by emergency responders and military personnel to maintain contact in remote areas. Jessica Morrison wasn't just a concerned mother traveling with her children. She was federal law enforcement. The realization hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The FBI or Homeland Security had placed an undercover agent on Flight 447, which meant they'd known about Malik's operation in advance and had been preparing their own countermeasures. But if Jessica Morrison was federal law enforcement, that also meant she was probably armed and had backup plans that Rebecca wasn't aware of. Plans that might not account for the safety of civilian passengers. Malik examined the device carefully, his expression growing darker by the second. When he looked up at Jessica Morrison, there was no longer any pretense of professional courtesy in his voice. "Agent Morrison, I presume?" Jessica's cover was blown, but she maintained her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. FBI? Homeland Security? Does it matter?" Malik held up the satellite communicator. "This is military-grade equipment. Definitely not available to civilian diabetics." The cabin went dead quiet. Every passenger was now staring at Jessica Morrison, realizing that their fellow traveler was actually a federal agent who had been concealing her identity throughout the hijacking. "Here's what's going to happen," Malik continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Agent Morrison is going to contact her handlers and tell them that any attempt to interfere with my operation will result in immediate consequences for all passengers." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And if I detect any other federal agents among my passengers, the consequences will be much more severe." Rebecca's mind raced as she processed this new development. Jessica Morrison's exposure as a federal agent changed everything. It confirmed that this hijacking was part of a larger operation that law enforcement had been tracking. But it also meant that whatever Malik had planned, it was important enough that federal agencies were willing to risk civilians' lives to stop it. More immediately, it meant that Malik would now be suspicious of every passenger, including Rebecca. She needed to act soon, before Malik started looking more carefully at the other travelers and discovered that the quiet IT consultant in seat 12A was actually a former Navy SEAL with the skills to end his operation. Because if Jessica Morrison's cover could be blown by a satellite communicator in her luggage, Rebecca's cover could be blown by anyone who looked closely enough at the small trident patch on her backpack, the patch that marked her as someone with the training to take control of an aircraft at 35,000 feet. Even if it meant fighting her way through 3 armed hijackers to do it. The moment Jessica Morrison's identity was exposed, Rebecca knew she had maybe 60 seconds before Malik started systematically examining every passenger for signs of federal involvement. She also knew that once he started looking closely, her own cover wouldn't survive scrutiny. But 60 seconds was exactly how long she needed. "Dr. Kim," Rebecca said urgently, leaning across the aisle one final time. The elderly woman, Dorothy Patterson. "I think she's going into diabetic shock." Dr. Kim's head snapped toward Dorothy's seat, where the older woman was indeed looking pale and disoriented. Frank Patterson was holding his wife's hand, but when he caught Rebecca's eye, there was understanding there. He knew exactly what Rebecca was asking him to do. "She needs medical attention immediately," Dr. Kim announced. Standing up from her seat, Malik spun toward the commotion, momentarily distracted from his interrogation of Jessica Morrison. "What's happening?" "Medical emergency," Dr. Kim said with the kind of authority that made people listen. "This woman needs immediate glucose and oxygen support, or she could go into a coma." It was all the opening Rebecca needed. While Malik's attention was focused on Dr. Kim and Dorothy Patterson, Rebecca moved. Not toward the front of the cabin where she'd be visible, but toward the rear of the aircraft where the manual emergency systems were located. She covered the 20 feet to the rear galley in less than 5 seconds, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years training for exactly this kind of close-quarters operation. Her romance novel fell forgotten in the aisle behind her. The manual release for the emergency oxygen system was located behind a small panel marked Crew Only near the rear exit. Rebecca had spotted it during her earlier reconnaissance mission with Tyler. Now she yanked the panel open and reached for the bright red handle inside. Emergency oxygen deployment would do 3 things. First, it would drop oxygen masks throughout the cabin, creating chaos and confusion. Second, it would trigger automatic alarms that would force immediate communication between the cabin and cockpit. Third, and most importantly, it would activate the aircraft's emergency protocols, overriding any electronic interference. Malik might have installed. Rebecca pulled the handle. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling throughout the cabin with a loud pneumatic hiss. Emergency lighting activated along the floor. Most critically, the aircraft's communication system automatically opened a channel between the cabin and cockpit. "This is Captain Williams." The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "We're showing an emergency oxygen deployment. What's your status back there?" But Rebecca wasn't done. While passengers throughout the cabin scrambled to put on their oxygen masks following years of safety briefing conditioning, she moved to the next phase of her plan. The manual control for cabin pressure equalization was located in the same service panel. If she could partially decompress the cabin, it would force the aircraft to descend to a lower altitude where the fighter escorts could provide more direct assistance. More importantly, it would create a physiological crisis that would overwhelm Malik's ability to maintain control. Rebecca reached for the pressure release valve, but that's when she felt the knife blade against her throat. "Step away from the controls," Omar said, his voice shaking with adrenaline and panic. He had followed her to the rear of the cabin during the confusion, probably on Malik's orders. But Omar was terrified, sweating, and holding the knife with the kind of grip that suggested he'd never actually used it as a weapon before. "You're making a mistake," Rebecca said quietly. "Not moving away from the controls, but not reaching for them either. Shut up and get back to your seat." Omar pressed the knife closer to her throat, but his hand was trembling. That's when Rebecca made a decision that would end the hijacking in the next 30 seconds. Instead of stepping away from the controls, she shifted her weight slightly backward, pressing against the knife just enough to make Omar think she was complying. But the movement also put her in position to execute a disarming technique she had practiced thousands of times in SEAL training. "Okay," she said. "I'm moving away." She rotated her body as if to step clear of the controls, but instead of moving away, she pivoted on her left foot and drove her right elbow backward into Omar's solar plexus. The knife flew out of his hand as he doubled over. Gasping for air. Rebecca caught the knife before it hit the floor and in the same smooth motion spun back toward the emergency controls. But now she wasn't alone at the back of the aircraft. Frank Patterson had left, his wife with Dr. Kim, and was moving down the aisle with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Despite being 75 years old, the Army veteran moved with the kind of controlled aggression that Rebecca recognized immediately. "Ma'am," Frank said as he reached her position, "it looks like you could use some backup." Behind him, Robert Chun was also moving. No longer the frustrated businessman, but clearly someone who had decided that passive resistance was no longer an option. His wife Linda was right behind him, and Rebecca realized that the Chuns weren't just angry passengers either. They moved with too much coordination and purpose. "Who are you people?" Omar gasped from the floor where he was still trying to catch his breath. Rebecca looked down at him and made a decision. The time for maintaining her cover was over. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small leather wallet. Inside was an ID card that Omar probably wouldn't recognize, but that any federal law enforcement officer would know immediately. "Rebecca Torres," she said, showing him the identification. "United States Navy, Special Warfare Command." Omar's eyes widened as he processed what that meant. Navy Special Warfare was the official designation for the SEAL teams, and "Mr. Patterson here is U.S. Army Special Forces, retired," Rebecca continued. "Mr. and Mrs. Chun are probably FBI or Homeland Security, based on their movement patterns and coordination." Robert Chun nodded grimly. "FBI. We've been tracking Malik's operation for 6 months. The pieces were falling into place now." Flight 447 hadn't been randomly selected by hijackers. It had been carefully chosen by federal law enforcement as the location for a controlled takedown of Malik's terrorist cell. "How many of you are there?" Rebecca asked. 4 agents total," Linda Chun replied. "Jessica Morrison in the front, my husband and me, and 1 more in first class." Rebecca processed this information quickly. Federal law enforcement had placed 4 agents on Flight 447, which meant they had detailed intelligence about Malik's operation. But it also meant that Malik had walked into a trap, which made him exponentially more dangerous. "Where's Malik now?" Rebecca asked. Frank Patterson, who had been monitoring the front of the cabin, answered grimly. "He figured out something was wrong when the oxygen masks deployed. He's got Jessica Morrison at knife point, and he's demanding to know how many federal agents are on board." "And Youssef?" "Panicking in the middle cabin. The passengers are starting to ignore him." Rebecca looked at the emergency controls one more time. She could still partially decompress the cabin and force an emergency descent. But with federal agents throughout the aircraft and Malik holding a hostage, the situation had become much more complex. That's when she heard Malik's voice over the aircraft's intercom system. He had somehow gained access to the pilot's communication system. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have been less than honest with each other." Malik's voice crackled through the speakers. "I know there are federal agents on this aircraft. I know this was supposed to be some kind of trap." Rebecca felt her blood run cold. "What you don't know is that I've been planning for this possibility," Malik continued. "The electronic warfare package I've installed on this aircraft includes more than just flight system access. It includes remote detonation capabilities." The cabin went dead silent. "Agent Morrison has confirmed that there are at least 4 federal agents on board. I'm going to give you one opportunity to identify yourselves and surrender. If you don't, I will detonate the charges I've placed throughout this aircraft." Rebecca looked at Frank Patterson, then at Robert and Linda Chun. The trap had just become a death sentence for everyone on Flight 447, unless Rebecca could do something that no one, not Malik, not the federal agents, not the fighter pilots escorting them, was expecting. She reached for her backpack one more time and pulled out the small trident patch that had been sewn onto the canvas. But instead of a fabric decoration, this patch was actually a thin ceramic composite that wouldn't show up on metal detectors. Inside the composite was a small electronic device, an emergency beacon that could transmit her military identification and current location to any U.S. Navy vessel or aircraft within 200 miles, including the fighter jets flying escort outside their windows. Rebecca activated the beacon and watched as the small LED indicator began flashing in the specific pattern that identified her as an active-duty Navy SEAL requesting immediate tactical support. Within 60 seconds, the F-16 pilots would know that there was a friendly operative on board Flight 447. More importantly, they would know that she had the training and authority to coordinate a military response to the situation. Hijacking was about to become a joint military operation, and Malik had no idea that the quiet girl in 12A was about to call in the cavalry. The emergency beacon and Rebecca's patch transmitted for exactly 47 seconds before the FAGA response came through the aircraft's radio system. But it wasn't the voice of an F-16 pilot that crackled through the speakers. It was someone Rebecca recognized from her years in naval special warfare. Trident 77. This is Overwatch Actual. Authentication, Charlie Lima 779er. Confirm your status, over. Rebecca knew that call sign. Commander Sarah Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Group 2. Currently deployed aboard the USS Bataan, somewhere in the Atlantic. But more importantly, Mitchell was the operations coordinator for maritime counter-terrorism operations along the eastern seaboard. Which meant that Flight 447's hijacking had just escalated from a domestic law enforcement issue to a national security crisis. With full military response authorization, Malik, Rebecca called toward the front of the cabin. "You need to understand what just happened." The terrorist leader appeared at the front of the passenger compartment, still holding his knife to Jessica Morrison's throat. His tablet was in his other hand, presumably ready to trigger whatever explosive devices he'd placed throughout the aircraft. "You activated some kind of military beacon," Malik replied. "Very impressive. But it doesn't change anything. I still have 47 hostages and enough explosives to turn this aircraft into debris scattered across 3 states. Rebecca looked at him with the kind of calm that only came from years of training for exactly this type of situation. "Actually, it changes everything. That beacon identified me as an active-duty Navy SEAL operating under federal authority. Which means this aircraft is now classified as a military asset under terrorist attack." She paused, letting that information sink in. "The fighter jets outside your windows aren't just providing escort anymore, Malik. They're providing targeting data to a naval task force that includes guided missile destroyers with advanced air defense systems." Malik's expression shifted slightly, the first crack in his professional composure since the hijacking began. "You're bluffing." Rebecca activated the aircraft's intercom system, using controls she'd accessed when she deployed the emergency oxygen. "Overwatch, actually. This is Trident 77. Request confirmation of theater assets available for immediate tactical support." Commander Mitchell's voice came through clearly, and her response was designed to be heard by everyone on the aircraft. "Trident 77. We have 4 FA-18 Super Hornets inbound from the USS Gerald R. Ford, ETA 12 minutes. Additionally, USS Gravely is tracking your position with SM-6 interceptor missiles ready for precision engagement. We also have a Marine Corps Force reconnaissance team standing by for hollow insertion if required." The cabin went dead silent. Even Yusuf, who had been struggling to maintain control in the middle section, stopped what he was doing to stare at the speakers. "Furthermore," Commander Mitchell continued, "NSA has confirmed complete electronic surveillance of all communications associated with this operation. We have identified and are currently apprehending your ground support team in Miami, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C." Malik's face went pale. His entire operation, whatever it had been designed to accomplish, was collapsing in real time. But Rebecca knew that cornered terrorists were the most dangerous kind. Malik still had his explosives, and he still had Jessica Morrison as a human shield. More critically, he now knew that his mission was blown and his escape routes were compromised, which made him willing to consider options that rational people would never contemplate. "It doesn't matter," Malik said, his voice taking on the flat affect of someone who had moved beyond caring about survival. "My mission isn't about escape. It's about sending a message." He raised his tablet, thumb hovering over what Rebecca assumed was the detonation trigger. That's when Frank Patterson made his move, the 75-year-old Army veteran had been quietly positioning himself throughout the cabin during the radio exchanges. While everyone's attention was focused on the conversation between Rebecca and the naval commander, Frank had moved close enough to Yusuf to strike. With a speed that belied his age, Frank grabbed Yusuf's knife hand and twisted, using leverage and technique rather than strength to disarm the younger man. The knife clattered to the floor, and Yusuf found himself face down in the aisle with Frank's knee pressed against his spine and his arm twisted behind. His back in a submission hold that would have made a mixed martial arts trainer proud. One down. Frank called toward the front of the cabin, but Malik's response was immediate and terrifying. Instead of being deterred by the loss of one of his subordinates, he pressed the knife harder against Jessica Morrison's throat. "Agent Morrison dies in 5 seconds unless everyone backs away," he announced. 4, 3, 2, wait, Rebecca said, stepping into the aisle where Malik could see her clearly. For the first time since the hijacking began, Rebecca allowed her true nature to show completely. Gone was the frightened civilian, the helpful nurse, the accommodating passenger. In their place was a Navy SEAL with 8 years of combat experience and the kind of controlled lethality that made people instinctively step back. "Let's talk about your real mission, Malik," she said, walking slowly toward the front of the cabin. "You think you know what this is about?" Malik replied, but there was something in his voice that suggested he was interested in hearing her assessment. "I think this was never about hijacking an aircraft," Rebecca said. "I think this was about forcing a specific federal response. You wanted law enforcement agents on this plane. You wanted military involvement. You wanted to create a high-profile incident that would demonstrate something." She was 10 feet away from him now, close enough to see the sweat on his forehead, despite his outward calm. "The question is what you were trying to demonstrate, and to whom?" Malik's eyes narrowed. "You're smarter than I expected." "I'm a lot of things you didn't expect," Rebecca replied, "including someone who's been in enough hostage situations to know that you don't actually want to detonate those explosives." "And why is that?" "Because you went to a lot of trouble to get specific people onto this aircraft. Federal agents, military personnel, civilians with particular backgrounds. If you just wanted to blow up a plane, you could have done that on the ground before takeoff." Rebecca took another step closer. "You want an audience for whatever demonstration you're planning. But your audience includes people with the training to stop you." That's when Malik made his critical mistake. Instead of maintaining his focus on Jessica Morrison and the approaching CAL, he glanced toward his tablet to check the status of his explosive devices. It was a fraction of a second of inattention, but it was enough. Rebecca covered the remaining 8 feet between them in less than 2 seconds, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years training for close-quarters combat. Her first strike was designed to disable Malik's knife hand, a sharp blow to his wrist that caused the weapon to fly across the narrow galley. Her second strike was aimed at his tablet hand, knocking the device away from his fingers before he could activate any detonation sequence. But Malik was better trained than Omar or Yusuf had been. Instead of collapsing or trying to retrieve his weapons, he responded with his own combat techniques, throwing a punch aimed at Rebecca's throat that would have been devastating if it had connected. Rebecca blocked the strike and countered with an elbow to his solar plexus, but Malik absorbed the blow and grabbed Jessica Morrison, apparently intending to use the FBI agent as a human shield even without his knife. That's when Jessica Morrison demonstrated that she wasn't just a passive victim either. Federal agent had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The moment Malik's attention shifted to Rebecca, Jessica twisted out of his grip with a move that spoke of extensive defensive tactics training. Instead of trying to get away from the fight, she positioned herself to assist Rebecca in subduing the terrorist leader. The battle in the aircraft's narrow galley lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was the most intense hand-to-hand combat Rebecca had experienced since her deployment in Syria. Malik was skilled, desperate, and fighting for his life. But he was also outnumbered by two highly trained federal operatives in a confined space that favored defenders over attackers. The fight ended when Rebecca managed to get behind Malik and apply a rear naked choke hold, a submission technique that cut off blood flow to the brain and rendered him unconscious within seconds. As Malik's body went limp, Jessica Morrison immediately began searching for the tablet that controlled the explosive devices. She found it wedged between two seats where it had fallen during the struggle. "Robert," Jessica called Agent Chun. "I need your bomb disposal kit." Robert Chun was already moving forward, pulling a small black case from his carry-on luggage. Rebecca realized that the FBI agents had been prepared for the possibility of explosive devices from the beginning. While Agent Chun worked on disabling whatever detonation system Malik had installed, Rebecca activated the aircraft's communication system one more time. "Overwatch actually, this is Trident 77. Primary threat neutralized. Two subordinate threats were also neutralized. Request immediate coordination with aircraft crew for emergency landing and federal custody. Transfer." Commander Mitchell's response was immediate. "Outstanding work, Trident 77. We're coordinating with Miami-Dade Airport for priority landing. FBI tactical teams are standing by for prisoner transfer. Medical personnel are also standing by for passenger evaluation. Captain Williams'" voice came over the intercom from the cockpit. "This is the flight crew. We're beginning immediate descent to Miami International. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of controlled activity. The flight attendants, who had been remarkably professional throughout the entire hijacking, began securing the cabin and preparing passengers for landing. Dr. Kim checked on Dorothy Patterson and confirmed that the elderly woman was stable. Her apparent diabetic crisis had been performance worthy of an Academy Award. Frank Patterson zip-tied Youssef using restraints that Robert Chun had provided, while Linda Chun collected evidence and documented the scene for the federal prosecution that would inevitably follow. Rebecca found herself sitting in her original seat, watching the Florida coastline approach through the small aircraft window. Her romance novel was still on the floor where she'd dropped it when the action started, its pages scattered and forgotten. Tyler, the 8-year-old boy who had needed to use the bathroom, approached her seat tentatively. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "are you really a Navy SEAL?" Rebecca looked down at him and smiled. "Yes, I am. That's really cool," Tyler said. "My dad is in the Army. He's deployed right now." "Where is he deployed?" "Afghanistan. He's coming home next month." Rebecca felt something tight in her chest ease slightly. "I bet he's very proud of how brave you were today." Tyler nodded seriously. "I wasn't really scared. I knew the grown-ups would figure out how to fix everything. It was the kind of absolute faith that children had in adult competence. And Rebecca found herself hoping that Tyler would never lose that trust in the people whose job it was to keep him safe. Flight 447 touched down at Miami International Airport 18 minutes later, surrounded by more federal law enforcement vehicles than Rebecca had ever seen in one place. FBI tactical teams boarded the aircraft immediately, taking custody of Malik, Omar, and Youssef with the kind of professional efficiency that spoke of extensive planning. Passengers were escorted off the aircraft in small groups, with federal agents conducting brief interviews to gather initial witness statements. Rebecca was among the last to leave, having spent additional time coordinating with the FBI team leaders and providing detailed information about Malik's electronic warfare capabilities. As she finally walked down the aircraft's exit ramp, Rebecca was met by a woman in a Navy officer's uniform, Commander Mitchell, who had apparently flown in from the USS Bataan specifically to debrief the operation. "Lieutenant Torres," Commander Mitchell said, returning Rebecca's salute. "Outstanding work up there. Your tactical response prevented what could have been a significant loss of life. Thank you, ma'am." I was just doing my job. Your job is cybersecurity consultant for defense contractors. Commander Mitchell replied with a slight smile. Taking down terrorist cells at 35,000 feet is significantly above and beyond your current duties, Rebecca nodded. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. It was exactly the right thing to do. Which is why I'm here to discuss your next assignment. Rebecca looked at her curiously. The terrorist cell that Malik was part of represents a new kind of threat, Commander Mitchell continued. They're using sophisticated electronic warfare techniques combined with traditional terrorist tactics. The Navy needs people who understand both domains. She handed Rebecca a folder, marked Classified, Joint Terrorism Task Force, Cyber Division. Based out of Norfolk, reporting directly to SOCOM. Your experience today makes you uniquely qualified for what we're dealing with. Rebecca opened the vase folder and scanned the first page. It was a new assignment that would combine her SEAL training with her cybersecurity expertise, focusing on counter-terrorism operations that involved electronic warfare. When do I start? Rebecca asked. Monday, Commander Mitchell replied. Assuming you're interested. Rebecca looked back at Flight 447, where federal crime scene investigators were documenting evidence and aircraft technicians were examining the electronic devices that Malik had used to compromise the plane systems. She thought about Tyler, whose father was deployed in Afghanistan fighting a different kind of war. She thought about Dorothy and Frank Patterson, whose generation had faced their own threats and had done what needed to be done. She thought about Dr. Kim, who had used her medical expertise to help coordinate passenger resistance. Most of all, she thought about the 47 innocent people who had boarded a flight from Denver to Miami, expecting nothing more exciting than airline peanuts and in-flight magazines. Yes, ma'am, Rebecca said. I'm very interested. 6 months later, Rebecca Torres was leading a joint military FBI task force that had disrupted 3 more terrorist cells using similar electronic warfare techniques. The methods she'd developed during the Flight 447 incident, combining traditional special operations tactics with cybersecurity expertise, had become standard protocol for counter-terrorism operations involving aircraft security. Malik, Omar, and Youssef were serving life sentences in federal prison. The electronic warfare techniques they'd used were now part of Department of Homeland Security training programs for aviation security personnel. Jessica Morrison received a commendation for her undercover work and was promoted within the FBI's counterterrorism division. Frank Patterson was invited to speak at Army Special Forces reunions about his role in the operation, though he typically declined, preferring to spend time with Dorothy and their grandchildren. Dr. Kim returned to her cardiac surgery practice but also began volunteering with federal programs that trained medical personnel to respond to terrorist incidents. Tyler's father returned safely from Afghanistan and was told the full story of his son's adventure on Flight 447. He wrote a letter to Rebecca thanking her for keeping Tyler safe, which she kept in her office at the Joint Terrorism Task Force headquarters in Norfolk. Robert and Linda Shun continued their work in federal law enforcement, specializing in operations that required married couples to work undercover together, and Rebecca Torres kept the small trident patch that had been sewn onto her backpack during that flight. It sat on her desk at her new office, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles were fought by people who looked like they were just minding their own business. The patch served another purpose too. It reminded her that competence and preparation were more powerful than aggression and intimidation, that quiet professionalism could overcome loud threats, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimated was exactly the person who could save everyone's life. Flight 447 had lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes from takeoff to landing. In that time, 3 amateur terrorists had learned that hijacking an aircraft filled with federal agents and military Personnel was a very poor life choice. But more importantly, 47 innocent passengers had learned that, when bad things happened to good people, there were still quiet professionals who would step up and do whatever needed to be done to bring everyone home safely, even if they had to do it while pretending to read a romance novel at 35,000 feet. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.